My name is Gary Zinsky. I'm the director of the UC Center Sacramento, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our center today for a discussion about financing of government. And we've got four very interesting speakers today, and I want to say that several of these, two of these speakers were yesterday at an informational hearing at the Senate Rev and Tax Committee, and I can't help but think that in this room there's collected a lot of people who have been associated with the development of revenue and tax policy in this state for a long time, and people who I am sure are going to be part of the solution to our problems going forward. And I want to say that some of the traditions live on. I referenced, for those of you who were here about 4 minutes ago, Martin Helmke, and those of you who know Martin and know the sense of humor that he has will appreciate that some of the subtitles for the bill analyses that were reviewed yesterday from Rev and Tax are Marty McFly is alive and well, bracketology, and of geese and golden eggs. And when Martin does join us, if he will today, he can explain what that's all about. It's a famous parable.
He's in London here.
Oh, I am so sorry. Well, in that case, we can talk about it. Let me introduce the four speakers. What we're going to do is arrange for everybody to have their say, and then, again, taking advantage of a very interested and well-informed crowd, we're going to open it up. I was going to make a joke that the situation in the state is so dire that we call it on a panel that consists largely of lawyers to talk about it, but I won't say that, because that would be, no economist would insult lawyers like that, and I would be the last to do that. Let me, though, say that if you're here for the first time and want to get on our mailing list, please see the folks at the table at the back, and our next public event will be next Friday, a week from tomorrow, and it will be with Dr. Yoram Cohen from UCLA on smart water systems. So if you're interested in water, please come to that. Okay, our speakers today in alphabetical order are David Gamage, who is sitting right here in the middle. David is an assistant professor of law at the UC Berkeley School of Law. He came there from UT Austin, where he was an assistant professor. He has a JD from Yale, was a senior editor on the Yale Law Journal, and launched as an economics fellow. He has an MA in economics and sociology from Stanford and a BA from Stanford as well. Next we have an alphabetical order, Mark Paul, my colleague, and I should say, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that this session is co-sponsored by our center and New America. We're very proud of sponsoring numbers of events with New America, and including this, in effect, what's becoming a series on state revenue policies. Mark Paul is senior scholar with New America Foundation. He's covered California for many years as the editorial page editor and national editor of the Oakland Tribune, and worked as well as deputy editorial page editor and columnist for the Sacramento Bee. He has won awards for his editorial writing about California policy. He's worked as deputy treasurer and policy director in the state treasurer's office, and has a BA and master's from Stanford University. He's taught at Simon Fraser University and Stanford University, and was an editor of Inquiry magazine that was published by the Cato Institute. Thirdly, we have Darian Shansky. Darian's the other, I think it's a power forward position or something. Darian holds a JD from Stanford and a PhD from UC Berkeley in rhetoric, an MA from McGill University in philosophy, and a BA from Columbia University. Prior to his going to law school, he worked as a financial consultant for California's local governments, and then after law school worked as an attorney in the public finance department of Sidley, Austin, and San Francisco. He has clerked for Judge Pierre Laval of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. And finally, Curt Stark, who from UCLA School of Law, I think that you will remember the professor from UCLA who came and joined us, I believe, last August. And Curt is an esteemed faculty member at UCLA. He was twice elected Professor of the Year by law school graduating classes, and in 2003 received the University Distinguished Teaching Award. He has published in many areas, and I want to point out a recent book called War and Taxes, which he co-authored, that offers a political history of U.S. tax policy during wartime. He's on the board of directors of the National Tax Association and was this year a visiting professor at Harvard Law School. So this is a very distinguished and diverse group of people, and it's my great pleasure to introduce them. The way we're going to go is, Mark, are you going to speak first?
Yes,
Mark's going to kick it off.
Thank you, Gary, and welcome to all of you. As I was putting together this talk, I remembered a time a number of years ago when I was at the Bee interviewing Tom McClintock. Many of you will know Tom as a longtime member of the Assembly and State Senate here, who is now has taken his lance to Washington to tilt at federal issues. But when I'm talking to Tom, I asked him, after listening to him talk about, the California's problems, when did he think the things were right in California? And Tom thought about it, and he said, well, he thought that California worked right, back when he was young in the late '60s when Ronald Reagan was governor. And I've thought a lot about that over the years. To try to figure out exactly what Tom was talking about. And I don't think he was talking about, the fact that Ronald Reagan was the governor who raised California's personal income tax rates to 11%. And I don't think he was happy about that era because of the explosion of the welfare rolls that was going on in the late 1960s. And so for looking in that era for something that a conservative like Tom would love, the only thing I can really find was that back in the late 1960s, is that California drivers actually paid for the roads they use. And so I want to talk today a little about where we've come since that time, and how Californians have become free riders, both literally and figuratively, when it comes to transportation. I want to chart briefly the retreat in transportation, but it also applies to some other areas of public finance. The retreat from the benefit principle of users paying for services that are demonstrably user-based, and especially here transportation. And then to suggest that perhaps that returning to those Tom McClintock's golden years of the late 1960s is important step we could take in California, both to restore fiscal stability in the short and the long run in California, and also for achieving our environmental goals, and particularly our very rigorous climate change targets for reducing carbon emissions in the state. And I think this is a useful time to talk about this, first of all, because at a moment like this, I think everything in California needs to be on the table, and we need to be rethinking how we do things. We are in a crisis of a kind that we've not seen in California since the Great Depression. And it behooves us in this time to be flexible and I think even a little playful with how we think about public finance, so that we can, perhaps get ourselves out of the current box we have. And also, I think that this subject is one where there's really potential for some common grounds between liberals and conservatives. After all, for conservatives, the notion of user payment and pay-as-you-go is a way to bring a more market-based approach to providing some public services, and also a way to reduce those services' dependence on taxpayers and tax revenue. And for liberals, it's potentially a way at a time when tax revenues are insufficient to cover our core public services, to think about ending subsidies that have a very weak claim on the public dollar. So let me first start with a little bit of theory, that the services that government provides are a range of public goods. Some of these public goods are of general benefit, law enforcement, for instance. It's something that we pay for as a government, but all of us benefit from in the society as a whole. You know, there are other public services that you might think of as sort of mix of public goods and a private benefit, such as higher education in California. You know, we all benefit from having a well-educated workforce. Our incomes go up even if we don't have educations ourselves. If we live in a state with highly educated people with world-class skills, all of us benefit. But higher education also directly benefits the individual who receives the service. And so when you think about how higher education might be financed, you know, it's a place where a mix of tax support and fee-based payment by the individual receiving the service makes sense. And in fact, that's what we have in California. And we can argue about what might be the proper mix between those two things, because different states approach the subject differently. But since I'm at an event being co-hosted by UC, I'm not going to really talk about that, other than to say that the law school people here have a very different answer to that question than they do at UC at the undergraduate level these days. But I'll leave that. Maybe we can talk about that more in questions. And then there's the final kind of services, which are really like economic goods in the marketplace. You know, for instance, in California, we have in Los Angeles and here in Sacramento, public districts that provide electricity service. But the service they provide is really, you know, just, you know, they're selling a commodity, electricity. The business is basically a lot like what goes on that the market provides in the rest of California. And so there are a range of things that are, you know, that government services the government provide that are really almost exclusively or primarily of use to the person who receives them. You know, your garbage collection, you know, as I say, your SMUD bill here in Sacramento, and that is, you know, the class of things I think I want to focus on here today. Also, you know, in theory, you know, before I get away from theory, talk just a little bit about the distinction between taxes and fees. And there's a tendency, you know, to cloud the distinctions between the two sometimes because you know, they both pay and it's just a word game whether it's a tax or a fee. But actually, I think, you know, there's really an important difference between the two. I mean, a tax is a compulsory levy that falls on everybody. It's universal on their income, on a property tax, or the rest. Fees, you know, when the word is rigorously used, are actually, you know, only paid by people who use the particular service. So, you know, the dollars you pay when you show up outside the state park to go into the park and enjoy a day, the fee for your campsite. Those things are fees. They are payment to government for a service, but you know, nobody has to pay that park fee unless they go to the park. So I think it's important to keep that distinction in mind. It's a real distinction, and it's a useful one that we need to continue and think about as we move forward. So let me get to more of the specifics. You know, for 40 years here in California, in transportation, we've been in retreat from the principle of user pay for roads. And roads and highways, I would argue, are much more like electricity than they are like public schools. And they are an economic good, primarily a benefit to the driver, you know, whether it's an individual or a business delivering goods and service over the system. And in fact, that's the way we built our road system in California over the first 2/3, 3/4 of the 20th century. Almost all of the money that was put into creating the system of highways with the introduction of the automobile was paid for through taxes on fuels primarily, and also on the local system on property taxes that were levied on people, property owners who directly benefited from the fact that they had a road in front of their house. If you wanted to, when we started paving the state, when the horse and buggies were replaced by cars, it was a benefit to the property owners, that the public came in and paved the road in front of their house so that the Model T, didn't sink up to its axles in mud every January in California. And we used that system very successfully in California to build one of the great road transportation networks in the world. Today, the portion of our road and highway transportation costs that are paid for directly by users has now fallen to about half of the total. And there's a variety of factors behind that. First of all, one of our primary methods of user pay for highways, which has been the highway user tax, which is levied at the gas pump and diesel on road users, has been a victim both of the changes in the technology in automobiles, the increased mileage in our cars, and also of the fact that in inflation terms, it's just not kept up with either our incomes or the level of prices. Average vehicle efficiency in California, the fleet average has gone from about 15 miles a gallon back in the middle 1960s to about 25 miles a gallon today. And that, because the tax rate is not kept up with inflation, and because the number of gallons people use per mile to drive has gone down over time, the actual yield of the gas tax relative to the scale of our transportation, our highway system, has gone down. And this problem is only now going to get worse, because California now has put in place its own mileage goals of moving to 35.5, fleet average of new cars sold in California, 35.5 by the year 2016. And the federal government, the Obama administration, now has adopted the California standards that we've put in place as the target for the national energy bill that they're going to try to pass this year. So as we move ahead, it's almost certain that unless we have a change in the highway user tax, that we're going to see the revenue both per mile and overall fall fairly rapidly again, continue in California. We could have raised that tax, of course, but there's been political resistance to raising all taxes in California over the last 30 years. And as a result, the revenue generated per vehicle mile traveled has declined, for instance, by 25%, just since 1991 in California. So we've had this problem for a long time. The yield from what the drivers pay at the gas pump is going down, and so California has tried to meet its transportation financing needs by backfilling in various ways, all of which involve taking general revenue that are paid in other general taxes and shifting it into the transportation sector. It started back almost 40 years ago with the dedication and creation of a 1/4-cent sales tax, which was dedicated to local transportation, which goes mostly to transit. And then the next step was the legislature authorized counties around California to pass local sales taxes for transportation. Started with BART in the Bay Area and with Los Angeles. These were dedicated mainly to transit, but over the last 25 years, those local transportation sales tax have taken have spread around the state and taken over a greater part of the load of financing transportation. They amount to about $3 billion a year, probably less today because of what's happened to all our tax revenues. But it's become a very significant chunk of the transportation revenue in the state, about $1.7 billion of it, which goes to pay for roads and highways. So a general tax, local sales tax, going to roads and highway. Next, we had in the boom years of the dot-com bubble, a shift to general fund revenues at the state level. In 2000, with the Traffic Congestion Relief Act, and then with Proposition 42 passed by voters in 2002, the sales tax paid on gasoline was shifted out of the general fund toward transportation. It's about $1.5 billion a year in the years in which the shift actually takes place. Hasn't been suspended by the legislature. And about 80% of that dollar amount goes to driving. Now, you could argue, and I know a lot of people did, that the sales tax on gasoline, no, that's just a user fee. You know, it's paid by drivers. It's no different from the highway user tax. But in fact, the sales tax is meant to be a general tax on consumption. And if you start taking the position that the use of a sales tax dollar depends on what product the user bought, then you could have a situation in which you'd have the school lobby arguing that every dollar spent on books and newspaper on sales taxes ought to be shunted off to the schools, because after all, who could read a newspaper or book if we didn't have schools? And in fact, Jerry Merrill, some of you will remember back about 6 years ago, actually tried to do this with the sales tax paid on the purchase of automobiles, to shut it off to a special uses for air quality and the rest, which the voters defeated, but he made that very argument. But I would argue that the sales tax paid on gasoline is a general tax revenue. It's always gone into the general fund in prior years. This was a shift, and it was a kind of attempt to fix the fact that we hadn't we'd stopped making users pay the full cost of the roads that they were using. And finally, then there was the shift to general obligation bonds, starting with Proposition 192 in 1996, which voters passed $2 billion worth of bonds to retrofit highway bridges for earthquake safety. And then with the capper coming in with Proposition 1B in 2006, where voters authorized $20 billion worth of transportation bonds to be paid for out of general fund revenues, which of course the state doesn't have, to do transportation infrastructure. Most of it, about the $20 billion, about $15 billion of it will go to roads and to users of shippers at the ports, mostly in Southern California, who are going to be getting a subsidy to pay for guideways to get their cargo out of the ports and to ameliorate the air pollution that they cause through that shipping. So where does that leave us? Back in Tom McClintock's golden age, when the Beach Boys were singing about Little Deuce Coups and the Thunderbirds and the car culture in Southern California, the Beach Boys were paying about 7.7 cents a mile in current dollars for every mile they drove on California's highways. Today, we pay half of that in the same dollars. It's about 3.9 cents for vehicle miles traveled on the state highway system. And actually, if you look at all of the transportation in Cal, all the roads that count the local streets, we're paying about two pennies per mile as drivers, as a user contribution to the road system. And so I would argue that in California, all of us are driving a welfare Cadillac. Users pay for only about half of the $14 billion of road that we pay for roads in California every year, which means a subsidy from public funds, other general dollars of about $7 billion a year. Now, in this crisis, $7 billion is the kind of number that you sort of hesitate. Is it worth worrying about? But it is real money, in spite of the scale of the problem we face in California, and it's something we really need to be talking about. First of all, we need to be talking about it for environmental reasons. Subsidizing driving distorts decisions about location and where people live, where they decide to work. It distorts their choices about what vehicles to drive, and it also makes our whole road system less efficient. To the extent that we allow drivers to pay less than the full cost of the roads, we are really subsidizing, not only causing congestion, but we are also subsidizing the very pollution that with our global warming policies we're trying to get rid of. And then on the fiscal side, we're really talking about taking away tax capacity that we very clearly need in California, even before this crisis, to pay for what most Californians regard as the minimal amount of services they want. In the three big areas that the state spends: to educate, to medicate, and to incarcerate. And as long as we're subsidizing drivers, we are going to have less of the things that Californians value most. So it's time to rethink, I think, the retreat from the user pay principle. In this crisis, the weak claims on public tax dollars should fall, and we ought to eliminate things, free riding by drivers before we talk about cutting back on public education, for instance. And I think it's a good time to talk about it because I think there's finally, as I said before, a time for some sort of political consensus here. There are reasons why both liberals and conservatives, should want to go back to the system of user pay for roads. And I can't think of a better time to start talking about it. It's not an easy thing to do. California's transportation finance system, like so much of California government, is marked with a kind of complexity that boggles the mind. But in this crisis, I think that it's something we ought to be talking about and tackling. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Shall we clap or shall we listen? Let's clap. All right. Is it over to you, Curt?
I think I'm going next.
We're just going to go this way.
Okay, we're going to go.
Just gonna go down the road.
Next, one of the original members of the Beach Boys.
Don't I wish? Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to say a few words about supermajority rules. Of course, in today's climate, there are two supermajority rules that are very important for understanding what's going on in the budgeting scenario in California. The two-thirds majority rule for raising taxes and the supermajority rule for passing budgets. Now, we take for granted, perhaps, how supermajority rules are working in California. But if you took, say, a Martian, had them read all the literature on how supermajority rules work in other contexts, showed them how supermajority rules work in business environments, in other states, and other political environments, and then asked this Martian to predict what would happen if a state like California adopted these supermajority rules, odds are the Martian would not predict anything like we see. So I'd like to talk about what the academic literature might predict about how supermajority rules will play out, how that might perhaps change in the future, and if we are to continue to have supermajority rules in California, what is the purpose of these rules, and how can we perhaps reform our budgeting institutions so as to preserve the purpose and intent of these rules while avoiding some of the harmful dynamics that perhaps are currently being created by them, and arguably we might see far more of in the future, depending on how far along this chain that the academic literature might predict we will see. So, what's the intent of supermajority rules in California? Presumably, we have a supermajority rule for passing a budget out of some desire to force a compromise, to prevent a narrow majority of a legislature from being able to have its fiscal preferences without having cooperation and consent from a legislative minority. Related but slightly different, why have a supermajority rule for paying taxes? Similarly, this rule might have an intent of creating compromise, but here specifically to make it so that taxes aren't raised, so the size of government isn't increased without some compromise behind it. So some idea perhaps of limiting the size of government. So if that's the intent of these rules, what would the academic literature say how supermajority rules might work? So I'd like to run you through 3 steps. The first step is nothing happens without at least a supermajority of votes. So we should have compromise. Everyone will get together, overcome their narrow interest groups, narrow preferences. If we have a preference of a majority coalition, a preference of a minority coalition, we'll have some compromise between these two preferences, and everything will be happy. Of course, that's likely. The second step is what we might call a game of chicken. We have preferences of a minority coalition, preferences of a majority coalition. Neither side can gain the majority for their preferences. So the question becomes, who gets their way? What happens if compromise isn't reached? And this is why, in the second step, we might call it a game of chicken. Just as if two cars are going down a road toward one another, whoever has the right-of-way is going to be the one who does not swerve before the other. The same here, the literature predicts one possible outcome is the side will have its way that least fears the failure of compromise. What bad things might happen if no compromise is reached? Here that means not having a budget. Who is harmed by that the most? Whoever is harmed by that the least is likely not to compromise, meaning that side will get its way. We might, to oversimplify, think that if Democrats tend to believe that state governments do more good things, and Republicans are somewhat suspicious about state government spending doing good things, at least as compared to Democrats, that Republicans might be less scared of a non-functioning state government and thus be less willing to compromise. As a simplified diagnosis, that might explain perhaps some of the dynamics going on in the budgeting scenario in California today. But the academic literature suggests that the dynamics don't stop here. The first step being compromise, if all is hunky-dory. The second step being the game of chicken. The third step the academic literature predicts is the use of pressure. Pressure can come in a number of different ways. As a very simple means of applying pressure, a majority interest group can try to peel off enough members of the minority group in order to overcome the supermajority requirement. This is often called bribery. Or more eloquently, or more politically correct perhaps, the majority interest group tries to peel off enough members by giving the flexible members of the minority coalition the ability to achieve significant outcomes that they desire in order to just get over the supermajority threshold. Pressure might also come from groups outside of the legislature through the use of interest groups from all persuasions. But another avenue in which pressure can be applied, which is an avenue that the literature often predicts solves the problem, yet, at least from my outsider's perspective, I don't see as being a dominant dynamic in California today, and I wonder if we might see more of this in the future, is pressure through the use of other legislative powers. So, many theoretical studies, again, not tied to specific environments, but these studies, the results of these studies are often found to hold true in business scenarios, say that if you have a governing body for which some decisions require a supermajority role, while other decisions require a simple majority role, the majority, through the use of its powers that are not governed by the supermajority role, can pass policies that the minority finds very offensive. And through the use of the threat of these powers, essentially coerce the minority to go along. And at this point in this talk, this might sound like I'm going to create the Machiavellian guide for the Democrats to take power in Sacramento. And that may actually be the outcome of this part of the talk. But I'll turn back to broader goals because this is meant to be a thought experiment on how supermajority rules are working and are likely to be working in the future and what we can do about it. So those of you who don't like the idea of the Machiavellian prescription for the Democrats to take power, hold your scorn and eggs for at least a few minutes. So with that said, how might that work? The literature, in a coerced sense, we might predict members of the minority coalition have interest groups who presumably the members of the minority coalition value. There is no supermajority requirement for regulation. So There's nothing to prevent, through a simple majority vote for the majority coalition, regulating important constituents in the districts of members of minority group in ways that those constituents find very unattractive. And regulations can be designed to, as I'm sure most people in this audience are aware, to effectively target very narrow businesses or bodies, even if they are on face broad and as applied. In a less coerced sense, what might a majority group do? What might the majority Democrats do? Well, here's one way to solve the budget crisis. And again, I in no way want to suggest that this is good policy, but it is a possible threat that could be used by a majority group. There is no supermajority requirement for increasing tax penalties. If legislated aggressively, most businesses, or at least many businesses in California, arguably are skirting the line for some areas of tax law. We could raise penalties 100-fold, 1,000-fold if we wanted to. We've already done it to a very minor degree. And if we're overly worried about the harmful effects of this, we could have what I call the extortion tax. Any business that wishes to can prepay some percent of revenues in order to avoid the new penalty regime. This would, of course, be challenged, but my guess is it would survive constitutional challenge in California, and it could be certainly designed in a way that that would at least be possible. And you effectively have a very bad business tax that can raise as much revenue as you want, that passes the supermajority threshold. So, let's take a step back. Again, my goal in sketching through these thought experiments is not to suggest really bad policy measures that the Democrats might adopt. My goal is to point out that the academic literature suggests that the game of supermajority rules doesn't stop at step 2, doesn't stop at the game of chicken. It moves on to the use of pressure, and if the threat of pressure doesn't succeed, the literature suggests increasing escalation. In other words, ever-increasing dire scenarios. The literature often concludes that the threat of this escalation moves us back to step 1, moves us back to consensus. In other words, the reason we might have this hunky-dory scenario, and the reason it works in many businesses, is that if the hunky-dory, let's all get together and agree in something between our preferences scenario doesn't work out, both sides have things that they can do that, while they might think are bad policy, they realize the other side will think is horrible policy, and thus they can credibly enact the threat of this as an alternative to the other side's preferences. And through the threat of repeated escalation, we get compromise. For some reason in California, though, we seem to be stuck at step 2. So my question is, why is that? I have no answer for that. Will we always be stuck in step 2? Or are we going to move down this repeated escalation game as we continue to have budget crises in California? Perhaps eventually moving back to step 1, cooperation, or perhaps moving to ever-increasing dynamic or ever-increasing destructive scenarios. If the threat of destructive cycles is not enough to produce cooperation, can we preserve the intent of the supermajority rules while avoiding these harmful dynamics? And I would like to suggest that the answer is potentially yes, although probably not without constitutional amendments. Unfortunately, in California, it seems it's hard to do much of anything without a constitutional amendment and voter approval. But the problem with the supermajority rules, according to the literature as I've described it, is that the absence of compromise is bad things. At the second stage level, the game of chicken, at the very minimum, we don't have budgets, perhaps ever, but at least until some date much later than is optimal. This interferes with planning on the part of all government actors and on the part of all private sector actors to the extent that tax base or rates might fluctuate as part of the eventual agreements. There is virtual consensus in the academic literature that having certainty and long-term predictability on both the tax and spending side reduces the harmful effects of taxes and increases whatever good effects we think we can get from spending. So not having budgets, having built-in uncertainty, is harm no matter where you sit on the political aisle. Furthermore, to the extent that borrowing is sometimes and likely to be part of the eventual solution, the absence of budgets and predictability means we borrow at much higher cost. Again, no matter where you sit on the aisle, this is a harm. We'd be much better off if the legislature could get its act together and compromise much earlier, if we could move out of the game of chicken back to the cooperation game early in the legislative process. So how might we get there? And I'd suggest the problem is an inherent tension between the use of supermajority rules and the annual budgeting process. On the one hand, the Constitution imagines the governor and legislature coming together to create a budget every year. On the other hand, it makes it difficult for that budget agreement to be reached. So my suggestion is all we need is a default, a baseline budget that would go into effect in the absence of legislative agreement. That baseline budget can be a continuation of prior year policy, adjusted based on economic trends, population growth, inflation. If of course, it would involve some degree of delegation to legislative staff or administrative agencies. But I'd suggest the legislative staff and administrative agencies already control most of the powers that they would need to adopt this baseline budget by virtue of their need to create revenue estimates, since in California, as in almost every state, the revenue estimates are binding on the legislative process. So either way, we have calibrations and predictions based on changing population and economic circumstances that have real binding effects in the legislative process. So under my alternative scenario, the legislature would have a 2/3 majority requirement to change the default budget, to increase the size of government, to raise taxes. In other words, all of the reasons presumably we have these supermajority rules. To prevent the legislature from increasing the size of government without some degree of consensus, to prevent the legislature from changing policy too much without some degree of consensus, would remain in effect, but yet we wouldn't have the fear of the absence of budgeting without compromise. So that's my ideal solution to the problem, but of course it probably requires a constitutional amendment. Back to the absence of a constitutional amendment. Where are we likely to go? Well, for a while, it seems to me, again, we've been stuck at step 2, the game of chicken. The worse California's budget dynamics get, and I'm sure all of you read the news, for both near-term and long-term, it's going to get worse before it gets better, as I'm sure is a surprise to no one. The more likely it seems to me that we are going to move from stage 2 on to stage 3. And whether that eventually brings us to some form of compromise, as perhaps we had in some golden age, or whether it makes the dynamic, creates a spiral of increasing harm, I'll leave to all of your imaginations. But the specter of increasingly spiraled harm, with severe threats from interest groups on both sides, from legislatures on both sides, is at least enough of a worry that I think it's incumbent on all of us to think past the current dynamics, to imagine both how it could get worse, but also how it could get better, and to think of how it could get worse primarily as a prod to incentivize all of us to return or to move forward to an era of greater compromise.
Thank you very much. The theme of sustainability is a good lead-in to Darian Shansky.
Thank you. Can you hear me in the back? My voice is giving way a little bit. So I want to focus mostly on the other supermajority requirement, the requirement at the local level for 2/3 majorities for local bonds or increases of special taxes. In general, what I want to start with is the academic literature for why a devolution to local control makes sense, and then move to some of the pragmatics of it. So the academic argument for the advantages of more local control over finances is very similar to the economic argument that Mark talked about in terms of user fees. At the local level, if you're willing to spend more for your schools, for your parks, those taxes, at least to some extent, partake in the nature of an investment, right? Everybody knows that your home value increases if your school district increases. To the extent that general taxation from the state level is going to improve your schools, which is going to improve your housing value, right? That's an inefficiency. It's an inefficient use of general tax resources. When you're willing to make that investment in your home, why are you willing to make it? Because it's a good investment. It's a larger inefficiency in terms of the overall government system, because obviously that means that more general resources are being used where they shouldn't be used, much like Mark described in the context of highways. I'm broadening that to lots of different local government functions. There's also, of course, a nice democratic accountability story that goes with more local control. Obviously, more local people can observe what's happening at the local level. And to some extent, right, obviously, all these things have been changed, right, by Prop 13, which takes the control of the property tax from the local level. And, things like the two-thirds voter requirement for bonds, right, precedes Prop 13, but Prop 13 also adds a two-thirds limitation for special taxes. Now, the question, of course, is the distinction between what should be funded locally and what should be funded by the central government, right? It's not clear, right? So one question is, how do we know that we're not in the right place right now? There are a few ways we can figure this out, right? One way is to compare California to itself before Prop 13, another way is to compare California to every other state. Another yet better way is to think about what's happened in California since the passage of Prop 39 in 2000, right? Prop 39 lowers the supermajority requirement for certain school bonds under certain conditions to 55%, right? That results in an explosion of school bond issuances, so about $56 billion since 2000. At least half of those elections, right, wouldn't have been approved at the old two-thirds thresholds. And that's probably an undercount because many school districts probably wouldn't have even entered into the marketplace thinking, if they didn't think the 55%, right, would be enough. So we have good reason to believe that we haven't gotten things right, and to the extent that we're considering default rules and trying to reconsider California government and reconsider how much is being paid for at the state level, right, this is the time to do it, right? This is the time to get it right, to get things off the state's books and onto local governments where it can be paid for. And this brings up, one of the sort of ironic elements of Prop 13, right? Prop 13 is about controlling the size of government, about controlling tax increases. Traditionally, these kinds of academic arguments for more local control, right, more federalism, are also about controlling the size of government, right? If local people have to vote on measures that benefit them directly, then the assumption is in many cases they're going to approve fewer measures. So one of the ironies of Prop 13 is that one limitation on government expenditures sort of canceled out another one, namely local control. And I emphasize this because to the extent there is all this pent-up demand for local services that would be picked up by locals if there was a serious devolution to local government, and there are serious proposals right now pending in front of the legislature, as I know many of you know, to change these thresholds. In the long run, it doesn't necessarily mean California is going to have a larger government. It might mean California will have a smaller government precisely because more functions will be under the control of local people. I should also emphasize that to the extent that these proposals require a 55% vote of local people before approving bonds or lowering special taxes, this is still a big change from before Prop 13, right? Prop 13 was a ringing sort of lack of endorsement, right, of the control of representative government over the general property tax. If we change the voting threshold as to special taxes or as to general obligation bonds, that will still require local representatives to enter into this process of direct democracy in order to get a 55% vote before they can proceed. That's a big change in terms of politics, in terms of the likelihood of tax increases. And of course, those kinds of measures, right, are much more narrow than sort of a general property tax increase. So it's important to emphasize that even though in some ways it would be going back to a pre-Prop 13 world, it would not entirely. There are a few special advantages aside from sort of general theory as to why you'd want to make this change now. For one thing, I think it's pretty common knowledge, and has been for a long time, that California's governmental structure, right, is unsustainable. And that is presumably one of the problems that California is facing right now, let's say, in going to the capital markets and saying, we need to borrow some money. The amount that California needs is really, I hate to say, it's very small for an economy this big and this vibrant and this diverse. And the idea that we're having these difficulties is really very perplexing, except for the fact that we don't have the kind of credibility you'd expect in terms of our ability and willingness to raise taxes. A really credible commitment, much less the real thing, that we're actually going to change our governmental structure to make it more sustainable, could reverberate throughout the capital markets and could have positive benefits immediately. The other thing about changing this threshold, again, is to the extent there is this pent-up demand at the local level, especially in the wake of the kind of severe cuts that are likely to come, this is a kind of a mini stimulus package, right? If billions of dollars are spent at the local level at least to make up for the state contraction, at least we're not doing as much harm to our economy in the midst of recession as we are otherwise by engaging in essentially pro-cyclical economic activities by going through these cuts in the middle of a recession, which is, by any account, sort of a wild thing to do. The other thing about empowering more local governments is that right now there's a federal subsidy whenever a local government uses tax-exempt bonds, or to the extent that imposes special taxes, right, you get the state and local tax deduction against your federal income tax. So in yet another way, the state is leaving money on the table by not empowering its locals to act. I do want to say a couple of more technical things, right, about these kinds of proposals. One thing is I want to emphasize that they not just be for bonds, but they be for taxes. It's important that the local governments are able to pay for the teachers to work in the schools that they're going to build. Typically, bond funds can't be used for that. They have to be used for capital projects. I also want to emphasize that there's to the extent that there needs to be a compromise about this, right? Prop 39 was a compromise, right? Prop 39 lowers the threshold in the Constitution, but in statute, the legislature says, here are some requirements you have to go through, including a maximum levy. To the extent that there's a concern that local governments might go wild, I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, would be to tie, to some extent, limit the amount of additional taxes they can raise. That's a reasonable compromise. This lower levy can be tied to higher impact projects, so right, to the extent we're concerned that our current set of local governments are maybe too balkanized and might not have the best long-term economic sort of projects in mind, we can give them project lists. So in the transportation area, we have regional transportation planning agencies that have priority. We can say, these are the projects you can fund, right? You have to fund priority regional projects. So that might be another opportunity. And in general, to the extent that we empower local governments, right, we give them responsibilities because the state is going to retract, but we give them the power to fund these responsibilities by lowering these thresholds. These additional responsibilities may, especially if we make other changes to local government law, encourage rationalization of our local governments, right? So to the extent that we have all these local governments and they've been sort of calcified by the post-Prop 13 distribution of the property tax, and they have limited responsibilities and limited incentive to change, if they're really given the ability to raise more money and the responsibility, they may begin to make deals with each other and consolidate and rationalize. That might be wishful thinking, but it's not impossible that can happen. And in terms of politics, I do want to point out one other thing about Prop 13 is that, right, to the extent that there was this enormous shift, right, from local government, right, to the state as a result of Prop 13, right, that was never voted on, right? Prop 13 wasn't about that. And this wouldn't be a bad time to bring them to the voters and say, is this really what you want? If it is, okay, but anyway, we may have no choice but to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And batting cleanup from UCLA, Curt Stark.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Gary, for putting this together. And my remarks will be relatively brief. I've been thinking ever since we started putting this together a couple weeks ago what could I possibly say coming up here that would be useful, that would sort of add to the conversation. It kind of seems like we're not really at a point anymore where we need more information. It's there's sort of a political problem, really. But that has never stopped an academic in the past offering up his or her own perspective. So I guess I would just start out by saying we know we're reaching, you can sort of feel that we're reaching a decision point, that there's a breaking point, something has to happen. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. There are both short-term and long-term considerations. Obviously, there are cash flow concerns on the very near-term horizon, but there are also longer-term and medium-term structural problems with the financing of California state and local government. And we know that we have the Parsky Commission, which has been hard at work with an extremely impressive membership and a number of witnesses. I don't know if any of you here have been watching the hearings, but it's been very enlightening, and we should hear something, I guess, sometime in the next month or maybe 6 weeks or so from them, and that may well change the politics of the conversation that we have about the revenue side of the equation. Once we have a bipartisan commission start saying something about revenue changes. So I guess as I see it, we have an incredibly complex and dynamic political environment with a lot of uncertain variables, uncertainty on the horizon. And so what I want to do is I want to layer on top of that yet another set of complicating variables which arise from a set of things that we don't talk about so much, but I do think could potentially be quite important over the medium to long term. And these are changes in the revenue structure at the federal level, because I do think that we're sort of at a point where we may actually see some fairly significant changes along a number of different fronts at the federal level, and these are things that we need to be mindful of that may ultimately sort of change the ground rules for what is possible at the state level. So I'm going to focus on 4 separate categories. I guess you could think of the first one as sort of near term, the second 2 is medium term, and the fourth one is longer term. The first one has to do with both the 2009 stimulus legislation that was already enacted and the 2010 Obama budget proposals. And I think it's fair to say, as you sort of we could look at particular provisions of this, but if you sort of step back from it, what you see emerging at the federal level is a decidedly more progressive federal tax structure. And I guess, sort of cite as evidence for that the new Making Work Pay tax credit that was enacted as part of the stimulus legislation, and the expansions to the earned income tax credit. In the 2010 budget proposals, we have proposals for extension and making permanent Making Work Pay tax credit. And then on the upper income side, we have a reintroduction of the pre-2001 tax rates at the top level from 33 to 36% and from 35% to 39.6%, in addition to increases to, I think, 20% for the tax rate on dividends and capital gains. So as I see it, there are 2 potential scenarios assuming that all of this is enacted. You could imagine this playing out 2 different ways at the state level. One, you could say, well, the politics that gave rise to those changes at the federal level are going to play out at the state level as well. So we'll see, more likely to see push here for progressive reforms. An equally likely, perhaps even more likely outcome, however, is that the shift toward a more progressive tax system at the federal level will make more palatable regressive tax reforms at the state and local level. That is what we're depending on your perspective, what we're sort of giving up at the federal level, we can sort of eat into some of that at the state level. So we might be more willing, for example, to see a reduction in the top rate here in California. I wouldn't be surprised to see the Parsi Commission come out with something along that lines, or perhaps some other type of tax reform at the state level that would have a greater burden on lower and middle income families. And one of the arguments being, in connection with those possible changes, the fact that there are changes taking place at the federal level that soften the regressive effect of changes at the state level. I'm not advocating that, I'm just sort of trying to predict what would be the nature of the conversation once we have these changes at the federal level. A second area is healthcare reform, which has been very much in the news lately. And I would, you may remember from the fall, when we had the Obama-McCain debates, there was a lot of conversation about McCain's proposal to tax, for the very first time, I think is how candidate Obama put it, to tax employer-provided health insurance. Of course, for decades now, we've had in the Federal Internal Revenue Code, Section 106, which provides an exclusion from gross income of employer-provided health insurance. And this is a provision that is also piggybacked in state law. Well, now, you may recall that Bush had a proposal to repeal Section 106 and to replace it with a $15,000 standard deduction. This was in, I think, late 2007 or early 2008. And then McCain's proposal, since that got a lot of criticism from the left in particular, because a deduction naturally favors taxpayers in higher marginal tax brackets, McCain came up with a proposal to not have a $15,000 standard deduction, but to have a $5,000 credit. And this was the proposal that Obama was criticizing in the debates. Well, now we have both Senator Baucus and House Ways and Means Chair Charlie Rangel expressing some openness or willingness to consider some type of change to Section 106. All right, so that's one area which, if that happens, and that happens on the near term, there's a very substantial tax expenditure in the California budget. I think it's something like at least $3 billion a year that could be on the table, or newly on the table, because there's a change on the federal agenda that will just absolutely change the way we deal with this. And it would be, in some ways, foolish for the state to continue to exempt this while we have a significant change at the federal level. The other change, I think, that is worth keeping an eye on at the federal level with regard to healthcare reform is the uncertainty relating to Medicaid on the horizon. So to the extent that Medicaid is used as the vehicle for extending health coverage to individuals, this is going to raise the question of what is going to be the state participation in that. And it would surprise me if there was a substantial shifting in the short term of these costs to the state. But over the longer term, I think the Obama administration is very keen on moving toward something at least approximating a balanced budget over the next decade or so, or very substantially reducing these trillion-dollar deficits as far as the eye can see. One way they might do that is to push some of this cost onto the states. So this is, again, an element of the federal health care reform that we'll need to keep an eye on. A third area, one that I know substantially less about, but I think is going to be important over the next year to 18 months, is the Waxman-Markey climate change bill and the adoption at the federal level of a cap-and-trade system to help control carbon emissions. And how that's going to play out in terms of what the state might do. There's been a lot of talk in the Parsi Commission of the possibility of a state carbon tax. And again, it's the kind of thing that you can sort of see Republicans and Democrats potentially coming together on. It's good for the environment. It's palatable in a revenue sense to conservatives because it's supported by economists, and it's tends to be regressive, and you know, politics makes strange bedfellows, and you might see some coming together around a carbon tax there. How would a state level carbon tax interact with a federal level cap and trade system? That's an incredibly complicated issue of federalism that I don't think anybody's given a lot of serious attention to. I'm not saying that it's necessarily going to head in that direction, but if we keep an eye on the Waxman-Markey legislation, this is again a kind of a change in one of the pillars of the ground rules that may affect the way we talk about things here in California. Finally, the fourth category is the Volcker Tax Commission, which was just appointed in March of this year, and they have a deadline for reporting their recommendations for fundamental federal tax reform of December 4th, 2009, which is, I had to sort of pinch myself this morning as I was thinking about this. It's less than 6 months away. So it is sort of strange that we have this state tax reform commission that has a deadline of July 31st, I think. So we'll see something here in the state, and yet we may see some very significant changes being at least proposed at the federal level by the Volcker Commission. If we have Paul Volcker and the other most prominent member is Martin Feldstein on that commission coming together to endorse some very significant federal change, that absolutely is going to have ripple effects throughout the country in terms of state and local revenue structures. Some of the things that have been thrown around lately, one is, and it wouldn't surprise me to see this, potentially integrating the corporate and personal income taxes. And rather than having a separate tax regime for C corporations, somehow integrating those two so that we tax business income only once. This is a recommendation that was made in the 1990 Treasury Corporate Tax Integration Report. And this would, if it were pursued at the federal level, would fundamentally change the equation for state corporate income taxes. So again, this is not something we can just sort of ignore. This is something we should be thinking about as coming down the pike. The other one, which is something that people have been talking about, of course, for decades, but now is getting even more play, is the possibility of a value-added tax at the federal level. I'll just share with you a couple headlines from the papers, May 26th, 2009, so just a couple of weeks ago in the Washington Post. The headlines were, "Once considered unthinkable, U.S. sales tax gets fresh look." And then the next day in the Wall Street Journal, "Is it time to start stirring the vat?" 3 days later in the Baltimore Sun, "Is a value-added tax around the corner?" I think the answer to that is probably no, it's not around the corner. But it may well be one of the items that's recommended by the Volcker Commission, and it could sort of, again, sort of start to change the dynamics of the revenue conversation, the conversation that we have about revenue sources at the state level. A federal value-added tax in combination with state retail sales taxes is a recipe for compliance disaster. Most countries that have recently adopted value-added taxes, I'm thinking specifically here of Canada and Australia, adopted those national level value-added taxes at a time when they were also fundamentally rethinking the fiscal relations between federal and state governments. And I think that's just out of necessity. You don't want to have these two very different types of consumption taxes operating side by side. And so if that is something that's taken up at the federal level, it's going to change the conversation that we have about the retail sales tax here in California. So the bottom line is, I think these are all really just questions. I don't have any answers, but I do think that we are going to be seeing some changes coming from the federal government. There are sort of pillars of the federal fiscal structure that are undergoing a fundamental transformation, and that's going to change the way we think about these same issues here in California. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Curt. Well, I feel strangely refreshed. I asked the gentlemen to come together here, and Mark and I were hoping we could shake it up by having some new thoughts, and this was very stimulating. Let us open the floor for questions and comments. Sir?
I have a few comments. First one to Mr. Chonsky. I think one of the problems with giving local school districts substantial revenue raising authority is the fundamental principles of the Serrano decision, which requires that each student have for their education. So those things don't mesh very well. My second comment is Mr. Gamage. And your ideal system was one that we've had, was the Riley-Stewart, 1933, when the two-thirds vote was first adopted by the voters. That was for budgets that exceeded 5%. Otherwise, you could have a majority of the budget. And then in the 1960s, the Constitutional Revision Commission put through the change as a non-controversial cleanup, make it all two-thirds. So the basic policy, I think, of voters is still to have this majority two-thirds, depending on the size of the increase of the budget.
Sure. I mean, two things about Serrano. First of all, this sort of devolution should include all local governments, particularly cities and counties. So, to the extent it makes good sense for general government entities, I mean, the effect of Serrano shouldn't impact that. Second, in an ideal system, there'd be significant variation of local funding because people would be allowed to invest in their schools. And to the extent that certain areas of the state fell below a baseline, that's what you use sort of general state revenue sort of to backfill. And my understanding of what was going to happen in California after Serrano but before Prop 13 was moving to something like that. And that kind of system, sort of a district power equalization system, is in place in other states. And so I'm not sure that giving more local control over school finances couldn't be done within the bounds of the Serrano rules of relative equality.
Yeah, and sorry if I wasn't clear. In no way did I mean to criticize supermajority rules. I wanted to speculate about how political dynamics in the context of a supermajority rule might evolve, and then my ideal system at the end was a proposal for how we could continue to have supermajority rules while preserving what I view as their intent, while avoiding the negative consequences of not having budgets, of having borrowing costs, of having higher planning costs. I'm not sure whether I think supermajority rules are a good idea. I see arguments on either side. But the purpose of this talk was not to criticize them. I certainly agree that all polling data suggests that the voters continue to support supermajority rules, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. But I do think we need to ponder how we should continue to have how budgeting dynamics might evolve and how they should evolve in the context of having supermajority rules.
I just want to jump in on the Serrano point and say a couple personal things about myself and then make a general political point. The personal things are, one, I am a very committed liberal. Two, my parents are both retired school teachers, public school teachers back in Indiana. And three, the very first paper that I ever published was a paper on school finance reform. And yet, right, despite those things, so I'm trying to build up my kind of liberal credentials here. If we were to have a constitutional convention, which is something that obviously has been talked about, I think the Serrano principle should be on the table. I'm not sure. I think Serrano as a set of guiding principles for school finance reform has outlived its usefulness. I think we ought to be willing to envision a greater degree of local control over financing for public schools in order to reinvigorate the education in California.
If I could speak as an economist for a minute, one of my takeaways of years of studying game theory, thinking of what David was reflecting on, is that many, many different solutions are possible in the games we play, as he provocatively pointed out. And one of your provocations was to think, with and without constitutional revision. And I would just point out, Curt, that your points are very well taken about possibly deep changes at the federal level as we see many forces in motion at that level. That would really raise the question of, if we were in fact going to go in that direction, what is the right moment to do that? Because if one constitutional convention would be difficult, two would be murderously difficult. And I know there's people in the room who've got deep experience of this, so let me turn back, and who wants to go next with a comment or a question? Please.
Back on local school funding bond, how many bonds are the cities and districts in East LA going to be able to fund? Who's going to look at their income, and who's going to give them the kind of funding they need to have to rebuild the trash towns, or not trash towns, but as the population grows, the percentage proportional of poor grows too, and they're packing out there, and they need more schools than the top level people do.
Yeah.
And Serrano does not, as I understand it, does not provide that kind of funding. So how can they get the lenders to lend money to places that don't have the income?
Well, there are a variety of answers. The first answer is right. Ideally, places like that shouldn't have to issue bonds, right? That's where the state central funding is coming in. And the idea of having a balance of local control, of central control, is if other school districts that can afford to fend for themselves that preserves the general sales tax and general income tax revenue to service those other districts. So that's one of the reasons why we have to make sure we're spending our very precious and limited general central dollars on those districts. I think it also turns out, right, that it's not obviously a lot of those places do have lesser property bases, but it's not uniformly true. And a lot of those areas have a lot of commercial or industrial properties, so relatively high property values. A lot of the people, because they're using the public schools, really see it as highly valuable and are willing to pay a higher tax relative to their income than other people. So I think the primary solution is this is what central tax dollars should be for. But I'm not convinced that that the number of school districts that couldn't pretty substantially look after themselves is as low as we might think.
Non-liberals would say, okay, so East LA can't raise the money, so we'll use the general sales tax, and the non-liberals say, hey, wait a minute, my sales tax up here then is going to go down to the guys who cannot fund their own bonds.
Absolutely. There is a real problem in sort of political theory and political discourse that if we continue to go down this road of emphasizing benefit taxes where they're available, that the public will get used to all taxes are benefit taxes and forget that that's not the case. I agree. That's a big problem. And to some extent, you could say that's what Prop 13 was, a failure of political discourse and understanding of the different ways taxes are supposed to be used. I don't have an answer to that except to say that there has to be political leadership and political maturity about that. To the extent that we don't have it, I'm not sure how to create it.
And if I could comment, that's why the distinctions that Mark made at the beginning of his talk about the categories of public good, it's very important that we have a very clear discussion about that moving forward. I see Fred wanted to jump in, so Fred, please.
I want to follow up on a question that Dave Moore raised about the history of public budgeting and the vote requirement. If there are some graduate students in the room who are looking for papers, those of you who require papers to be written, I recommend looking at the period that we had Riley Stewart between 33 and 62, when budgets then were biennial, they were 2-year in format. But take a look at both the economic backdrop of those budgets, the political backdrop of those budgets, to look and see whether or not the extent to which budgets grew by more than 5%, if the 2/3 vote mattered, or whether how many of those budgets were under 5%. I think it would be worth somebody publishing a paper on that. Second thing is with respect to the vote requirement and the difficulties that the legislature has in getting their work done, I would submit to you that simply having a default that's the prior year And our budgeting system is basically built on the prior year plus growth. That's how we do public budgeting in California. That I would suggest that you won't get budgets adopted for decennial periods, because the minority party will always simply say, well, let's just do what we did in the prior year. And in fact, one way to avoid this is to get rid of continuous appropriations. Only about 60 to maybe 70% of expenditures are in the state budget. The rest of it's all continuously appropriated.
Yeah.
That's a simple provision in statute. Repeal it. Put all expenditures in the Budget Act, aside from the federal court decisions about payroll and the like. And I would submit to you that it would be very difficult for the legislature not to adopt a budget or to have a governor veto it and send it back, when in fact nothing would get done on July 1st, were it not for continuous appropriations. So again, back to your graduate students, papers about that subject, because we have other states that do that. So some comparisons of other states have used it.
Fred, I have not looked at it comprehensively, but I think the answer to your question is the budgets in California in that period almost inevitably grew by more than 5%. The state population growth was running over 3% a year, and through a lot of that period, the economy, once we got through the Depression, was growing rapidly. The reason Dave said it was non-controversial in 1966 to make the 2/3 is we'd done it every year, because 5% growth was normal in California.
Yeah, if I could.
I didn't want you to give the answer to the graduate.
Well, but
I could say a couple of things. First, just to agree on that note, something very fundamental changed in state budgeting in the late 1970s, early 1980s, which was a change from very rapid growth of state government faster than GDP to more or less stability of state government as a percent of GDP ever since, which, whether that was a result of or corresponded with the rise of the modern conservative anti-tax movement, as we might say, that a graduate student could answer. But we live in a different era post-1980 than we did prior. But on the other point, so we could imagine two extremes. One is get rid of all of a mandatory entitlement type spending where authorizations are continuous and have everything under the general budget, or the other is my sort of thought experiment proposal of make essentially everything an entitlement type proposal. So moving to the level of theory, we could view, if you have a 2/3 majority requirement or any supermajority requirement and real disagreement, the ways to have an outcome here are, one, have a default, is my suggestion, in which case I see no particular problem if the legislature never overcomes the default. At some point, assuming then presumably the default is not so bad that it bothers people so much that they call for it to be overturned. But the other alternative is to make the failure to compromise much worse. This is often effectively what happens in parliamentary systems. If budgets aren't reached, the majority party is kicked out of power via new elections. The problem is we don't have that dynamic in state government budgets, and particularly in California. You might see Proposition 1F as a very, very minor step in that direction. We could go much further. If budgets weren't reached, we throw out the legislatures, we hang a few legislatures at random. If we went to that extreme, we wouldn't have the problem of failure of compromise. But just as a matter of descriptive prognosis, I am pessimistic that putting all of the entitlement programs into the general budget would overcome the dynamics that are preventing compromise today. I think we either need some mechanism for making the alternative to compromise equally painful and more painful than it's currently viewed by the minority coalition today, or to have some alternative to passing a budget, which was my suggestion, which would avoid many of the costs I described.
Can I just add, just in response to David, one thing that I think that you've left out of your discussion is a problem that you just touched on, which is the issue of political accountability. And we're here mostly to talk about revenues, et cetera, but a big piece of the problem we have in California and of the stalemate that the 2/3 has created is the 2/3 system creates a system in which there is no way for the voters to know who to hold accountable for the Sacramento's failures. Because, you know, either a budget is a bipartisan responsibility or there isn't a budget. And so if you don't like the budget that you've got, you know, who do you vote against? Do you vote out the Democrat, or do you vote against the Republican? And so there's another dimension to this, the beyond finances, and it's how you have a really functioning democracy. And I think that is one of we're at a crisis, not only financially in California, but just to look at the poll numbers, there is a lack of trust in government because I think people feel helpless to do anything about what's happening here.
I completely agree. And I just add, that's exactly what you saw in the voter dynamics to Proposition 1A,
exactly.
where both the liberals and conservatives voted against an attempt at compromise.
Yeah, just confusion. Yes. Please, sir.
I believe you're overlooking one of the other dynamics causing the budget delays, and that's the budget uses a cash register. And by creating the crisis of two sides, political action committees keep getting funded, so there's not a major incentive to stop the delay. So if there is a way to cut that back, and one of my suggestions was the first thing the legislature could do is pass a budget. They can't pass a bill until the budget's approved, and they can't collect any money until they've got the budget approved. But I think one of the fundamentals driving this crisis is just the two parties gaining the funding.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, as one method for approaching budgetary paralysis is to make the alternative to passing a budget more painful for everyone involved. So that seems like a reasonable, at least a reasonable proposal along those lines. Of course, it would come with costs, but any reform proposal is going to come with costs. So I would certainly be open to thinking about that.
Yeah, appreciate that. Different, yes, please, go.
Hi, I actually have a question away from how to change the budget process in Sacramento, and it's to Curt Stark's point about that. You know, there's a lot of talk that California's tax system doesn't meet with the 21st century and how we need to change certain parts of it. Although I'd argue against some of that because we do tax investment income. But there were proposals 2 years ago to institute a state VAT, and Professor McClure looked at some of these. And some of it had to do with actually replacing our income tax system because of the concern, especially from the administration, about its volatility, with some type of VAT, putting more emphasis on the sales tax. Other proposals along those lines are the tax and services, which other states do and we don't do at all. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on kind of fundamentally restructuring revenue just in the state without even looking at what the feds are doing as it relates to a VAT, keeping in mind that our sales tax is 10% in most places almost.
Yes, well, just speaking very generally, I guess I would say I think the California retail sales tax, or for that matter, the retail sales tax in place in most states, is a very poorly designed consumption tax. If the idea of the tax is to tax consumption, then for one, we wouldn't have things like you know, the ability to buy things tax-free from Amazon.com, and I know that you all are giving some consideration to that. We also would not tax in any way business inputs, which we currently do. So this is not a kind of a liberal or conservative thing. This is just sort of thinking about what does a good consumption tax look like. And a good consumption tax would not tax some of the things that we're currently taxing, and it would tax other things that we're not currently taxing. I think it would tax services more expansively than we currently do, although I do think that there's a risk if we go down the path of taxing services. There's a political risk that will want to draw into the base more business inputs, which is exactly the wrong thing to do. And when you start thinking about the kinds of services that are consumed at the retail level, I'm not sure that's really where the money is. You would know the answer to that better than I would. But if what we're talking about is taxing, greens fees at golf courses and massages and mechanics fees and things like that, I'm not sure that's a huge revenue boost for the state. But if the state starts looking at things like the legal services that Latham and Watkins provides to the Walt Disney Company when they acquire some other corporation, well, sure, those are services provided in California, but those are not the kinds of things that ought to be included in a broad-based consumption tax. And yet, politically, I think there would be a move once we get on the path of trying to tax services, of trying to incorporate things like this. Florida, of course, had this experience in 1987 of attempting to move in that direction. It was a disaster, and they repealed it retroactively, I think, their attempt to tax services. I don't think states really, I don't think California is that much of an outlier in this regard as your comments suggested. I don't think states across the board tend not to tax services. To some degree, yes, but I don't think it's something that we're dramatically different from the median U.S. state.
Would it be possible to create a state tax at all?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Professor McCurdy's looking at kind of a state tax.
Oh, a state value-added tax. I think it would be. Now he's written extensively on this. I suppose it's possible. It depends on how you design it. Both New Hampshire and, of course, Michigan have experience with what some people regard as a state-level value-added tax. There was Supreme Court litigation over the Michigan single business tax in the Trinova case. The Michigan experience is a very bad experience. Jim Hines, who's an economist at Michigan, who we're hoping to lure out here to California. Oh, we lost him? Testified before the Parsky Commission on the Michigan experience, which I think nobody wants to go down that path. I think it's an extremely hard thing to do in a multi-jurisdictional setting for one subnational jurisdiction to adopt a value-added tax on its own. I think it's something that has to start at the central level, and then we perhaps could have piggyback systems at the state level. But California to go it alone on a value-added tax, I'm not sure that's the best approach. There are other ways to tax consumption.
Well, I was going to say, Kirk, I was going to ask, what about the possibility of California doing a progressive consumption tax collected through the way we collect income tax? Is that possible at a state level?
Sure, I suppose so. I mean, in fact, I know that next week when the Parsky Committee, they have on the agenda now for their UCLA hearings a great deal of discussion of the flat tax. Most people don't recognize this, but the flat tax is in fact a progressive consumption tax. It's tricky. It's two different taxes. It's basically a wage tax on the one hand. This this is from the Hall-Rabushka original plan, and it was introduced as legislation. It's a wage tax on the one hand, and then a business level tax on the other hand, which is a modified subtraction method value-added tax, but which allows for a deduction of wages, which you don't normally do in a value-added tax. And the idea of doing that is that you're taxing wages separately. But that business tax starts to look a lot like the Michigan single business tax. So they're calling it a net receipts tax in their conversations in the commission. So one of the questions before the commission is going to be, is this net receipts tax, if they take it seriously, is that really going down the path of the Michigan single business tax, and is that something that we want to do? There are a lot of problems interjurisdictionally dealing with allocation and apportionment issues among the states.
So Charlie McClure, who is a very big advocate of that, has concluded that it's not desirable to do so at a state level without, unless it was piggybacking on a federal VAT. And I think most people both agree and would defer to him. I would suggest on a progressive consumption tax, even if you think it's desirable at the federal level, there's reasons where, well, it could be done at a state level, and it could be done not in the Hall-Rabushka way, not in a VAT way, but for coordination reasons, it would be more harmful at a state level than at the federal level.
I would think forewarned is forearmed, though, and if Kirk is right that this is something that may be coming, we definitely should run the numbers, as we used to say.
Yeah.
Let's see, we've got Colin. Why don't you follow up?
It's actually kind of building off what David had to say, I think David's argument was that we were kind of stuck in the chicken mode, and we haven't got to the point yet where the majority of the legislature started to use its majority powers in order to try to scare the minority into negotiating on the budget. And I would argue that not only has that already happened, but we saw the effects of it in February. In December, the legislature passed a proposal, a large majority vote tax increase by swapping out the gas excise tax for a gas fee, and then adding on some other taxes to fill up that gap. It would have resulted probably in a net tax increase and net revenue increase to state government had the governor signed it. But at that point, the governor decided not to. So it was the legislature's attempt to enact taxes by a majority vote using a kind of a creative way. It may have succeeded in court, it may have not. We don't have precedent on it. And then over the Valentine's Day weekend, we saw the budget enacted by supermajority vote, but along with it were a slew of majority vote bills that enacted the majority vote that rolled back environmental protections, completely rewrote the corporate tax, also several other things on labor and environment as well. So I think we have seen the adjustments of that power relationship take place in both and I think the variable is whether or not the governor would support the majority of the legislature's attempts to try to force the minority to negotiate.
Yeah, I appreciate your comment, especially in the way that you framed it, David, especially in terms of Gene Ross and the California Budget Project have pointed out some of the maybe surprising tax compromises that were passed in recent budget, but that's all part of a bigger game. And how far can we play the game? You made the point quite well. I appreciate that. Yeah, question.
How do you see the various possible taxes and changes that you've discussed relating to our current situation with local government, where we have the various local jurisdictions competing for retail in order to collect the revenue from the sales tax? It's one of their...
To the extent we have local governments, I mean, there is them competing with each other is both, is one of the reasons why there's supposed to be efficiency gains, but it's also a danger. It's about, fiscalization of land use, big box stores. To the extent that these proposals would broaden the kind of taxes that local governments can impose, the jurisdictions will still compete, but they will no longer compete for only the sales tax. So, for instance, if you could increase, let's say pass a parcel tax, or essentially pass a GO bond, which would be based on property values, you might have more incentive to, let's say, increase residential development, including high-density residential development. Apartment buildings are very valuable. They might pay a lot of property taxes. So it wouldn't eliminate competition. That is a part of the essence of the jurisdiction, of having many jurisdictions, and it has costs and benefits. And in an ideal system, the benefits would outweigh the costs, and some of the costs would be mitigated by action by the central government, as we discussed before. But right now, I think the worst pathologies that happen at the local level is that they're constrained from all these other ways of making money. They can only use the sales tax, and that just leads to a very sort of monolithic kind of competition where everybody's competing for the same kinds of things, and that really accelerates the race to the bottom. In order to get those kinds of retail establishments.
Appreciate that. Sir?
I appreciate your comments about giving local governments greater financial control. I question how willing voters would be to enact taxes, though, to support state-level programs, which is what some forms of local government in the state primarily do, counties in particular. And I think that voters would have a hard time with that, just as a brief comment. Also, to the road funds, you were talking about how much of the road, the burden of paying for roads falls to the general populace versus the users, but that's only the amount that we're spending on roads now, which is not sufficient to maintain the road system we have, much less expand or improve it. And I'm wondering if you think it's possible to increase the user fee portion enough to bring the general tax portion, without changing the general tax allocation to roads, if increasing the user fee enough to at least maintain the road system would bring that proportion more into an appropriate line.
And would maybe call the constitutional question that Colin pointed out.
Yeah, the highway user tax has not been sufficient even to cover maintenance, in California highways. So I mean, the sort of, roughly, we're talking about, there's about $7 billion that is coming from general revenue sources for highways and local streets and roads. That's roughly 2 pennies a mile. So if we were to go to, raise what user fees by 2 pennies per vehicle mile traveled, which would take us not back to where we were in the 1960s, because the 60s level reflected not only maintenance on the roads, but also the huge expansion that was going on in California at the time. I mean, we're certainly not going to be in the transportation expansion mode of the 60s ever again, I think. And also, I didn't talk about this, but I mean, one of the alternatives is that we have now, that has been theoretical, that economists have talked about for a while, is using direct, mileage fees paid by users, electronically collected. I mean, that used to be a little bit pie in the sky, but the objections to that, the technology has certainly made it possible. And one of the objections to it always used to be privacy. Well, do you want somebody knowing where you are all the time? Well, I'm willing to bet that in every pocket in this room, there is an electronic device that is telling, AT&T, Verizon, and by extension the federal government, NSA, exactly where you are at every moment of the day. So the privacy argument has begun to go away, and so we could look at, using like the fast track system that we have for the bridges and for the toll road, for instance, the 15 corridor, and now in Los Angeles they're looking at congestion pricing. So we could add, for instance, then congestion pricing into the mix, which would be very good. We could substitute using our roads more efficiently, using technology and payment systems for actually putting more concrete down.
The first part of your question was about the accidental tourist question, the funding of state services with local. Darren, you want to say a couple of things about that?
Right, to be sure, right, this is a flip side of the danger of doing this, right? I mean, to some extent, we have the political discourse problem that people just won't be willing to pay for these things anymore. And to the extent that local governments actually, because of their power to fund, actually begin to entrench on things, which we more, so the reverse of what we have now, they start funding things that will be better funded centrally. That's A, an inefficiency, and B, causes, right, this serious political problem in terms of doing this thing, in terms of backfilling those communities that can't afford to fund themselves and do require central funding. So aside from just, the plea, for have a better political discourse, I mean, I think one of the things, or a couple of things I want to add, right, one is that, if we had the proper series of packages, so for instance, having the kind of user fee system to actually pay for our public infrastructure, right, the state really would need less money. I mean, state level taxes should go down. I mean, that should be part of the deal, and I think that that's okay. And if that is okay, then maybe the political valence and salience of paying these state level taxes and feeling like, gosh, they're so high, when they kind of are, but they're kind of not, because our property taxes are so low, and it's sort of this much more complicated picture. I guess the other question is, just as a matter of political psychology, is that it's not clear, I mean, given what we know about taxpayers' understanding about where their taxes come from and where it goes, that there'd be this sort of immediate hostile reaction to state-level taxes. I think that the first reaction to the state contracting would be people wanting their basic services. I've had some contact with the local business improvement district. The central government said, we're no longer going to fund this. And the assessment district stepped up and said, we're going to fund this service. Now, on the one hand, this is sort of a disastrous story. It's a story of sort of really fundamental things being cut, and this local assessment district being unable to make the place better, which was the whole point. But on the other hand, it's a little illustration, and obviously, a highly anecdotal one, of the fact that local people, right, are willing to step up for those things that they consider to be valuable and take a load off the central government. And to the extent that that were to happen, I mean, that might not be a bad thing. Do you want to follow?
Well, and I think that problem would be solved a little bit if there was a purposeful discussion about aligning authority over a program with responsibility for the program and the financing authority for the program, which right now is
totally
worse than a Florida ballot.
Yes. We vote for Pat Buchanan over and over again.
But I mean, I think if instead of just moving the finances, if all of it was considered at once, I think that could be overcome. Yeah. That issue of misaligning it in the other direction.
I think that.
Yes. Ma'am, and then we'll go to the back of the room. And you first, and then we'll go backwards.
You said something intriguing, which is, you said flat tax is misunderstood. It's actually a progressive consumption tax. And I just want to know what you mean by that.
So the flat tax, as proposed originally in the mid-1980s by Hall and Rabushka, consists of two separate taxes. I have a very slender book that you could probably get on Amazon.com for $8.95 or something.
And not pay sales tax.
And not pay sales tax.
And you can get it used for 99 cents.
It is my wife always criticizes me for going into this kind of teacher mode, so I apologize in advance. But I've talked about this so many times, I can't help myself. So it's two separate taxes. Normally, a value-added tax is simply imposed upon firms, and firms have value-added taxes. They take everything that's coming in from other firms, and they subtract what they're paying out to other firms, and it's the difference between those two that is the tax base. So value-added, the flat tax takes that basic starting point, but then adds in a deduction for wages, which you don't normally see in the value-added tax. And the reason that the flat tax does this is then what they do is they take the wage component out of the value-added tax and have it as a separate freestanding tax. And the reason for doing that is that you want to have that wage component of the tax system being taxed at the household level, where you have information from those households about how many kids they have, about what their annual wages are, things like that, and you can differentiate tax burdens at the household level with regard to wages. And then typically in the most flat tax proposals you have a zero bracket amount. The first 20,000 or whatever. So that's the sense in which it's progressive, is that there's a zero bracket amount and then there's a positive tax rate that applies to wages over and above that. So it is more progressive than a standard value-added tax. It gets there are a lot of people who like to distance themselves from the notion that the flat tax is a modified value-added tax, because value-added taxes sort of sometimes convey money machine, big government, but in its design, in its original design, that's just what it is. It is a modified subtraction method value-added tax.
To some extent, misnamed to that extent.
Misnamed. So David Bradford, the late economist at Princeton and one of the leading public finance experts in the 20th century in the United States and the world, had a similar proposal that he called the X tax. And it was really the exact same thing as the Hall-Rabushka flat tax, except he wanted to use the term X so as to imply a more agnostic perspective regarding the rate structure that would apply to the wage component. There's nothing about the design of a flat tax that implies flatness. So it's sort of a little misleading. You could have a steeply progressive wage tax as part of this, or you could have a regressive rate structure that applies to the wage component.
But most people who proposed flat taxes, imagine a single rate.
Single rate,
Single
yeah,
rate.
or at least an exemption.
Which is why that would, and for them, that was frequently the major appeal.
Let's move back again to the back of the room, starting with Gail.
Just on the idea of local taxes and aligning services with local taxes, and therefore taxpayers being more willing to pay for taxes. Two questions on that. I think that's probably more true in urban areas than rural areas. And yesterday in our committee, we had some discussion on equalization vouchers. So before, I think the idea that the tax burden overall can be reduced if you have some taxes at the local level and then we reduce taxes at the state level. And, there's a lot of discussion about this idea. I think the commission has spoken a lot about it. But I just wonder how you account for the fact that some communities really would be disadvantaged by